Hello Year 10 and welcome to another of Elle's lectures. You're probably getting pretty bored of this now and you'll be glad to hear that this is the last one. It is probably also the most important one actually because it's about the practice paper specifically that you'll be sitting after Easter. So one important thing is to make sure that you go through the Blood Brothers Bible, in particular that you know the social, historical and cultural context and how you might show that as a director and as an actor. That you also know your terminology in terms of things like lighting, so that you can talk about that in detail. And also that you know all the different stage types because they will appear and you may be surprised. So we're going to go through the exam paper now, not the actual paper, but the kind of questions that you are likely to get on your practice paper. So you'll often get a question about delivering lines and how characters should deliver certain lines. Now that will usually be a 4-mark question. So here's an example. Mrs. Lyons, she says, even when he was a tiny baby, I'd see him looking at me and I'd think, he knows, you've ruined me, but you won't ruin Edward. So you might, this is obviously an actor question, and you might get a question saying 2 ways how you would deliver this line and then explain your reasoning. So how you would deliver this line does not necessarily have to just be vocally, because there are things that you do when you deliver a line physically as well. So it could be about gestures, mannerisms, facial expressions, movement, as well as vocally. If you want to play it safe, maybe give it 2 vocal examples, but it doesn't have to be. And then remember that you can only get half marks if you don't do this for both of your answers. So that's the kind of question you might get. So just remember, it's from an actor's perspective, and delivering lines sounds like it just refers to voice, but it can also refer to how you deliver the line physically. You might get a question about how you would show mood, which is the same as atmosphere, in a moment of the musical through lighting. That could be a 4-mark question, it could be a 6-mark question. Remember, I said in a previous little tutorial that you have to state which moment you're talking about, and then again explain 2 ways that you would light that moment and how this would show mood. So this is the second part of the question, the bit which people often forget. It's a designer question, so for this you need to know your Fresnels, your spots, your different lighting states in quite a lot of detail, although it is only a 4-mark question. So to simply say that you would spotlight the brothers with a red gel to focus the attention on them in the opening scene would be enough for half of that question, and then just give 1 more example. And you might get the same for sound. So you might say how you would show mood or atmosphere in a moment through sound. Remember, mood and atmosphere does not necessarily have to be a tense mood. It can be a happy, jolly mood as well. You don't have to write about a dramatic moment. Again, you would state the moment, 2 ways that you would use sound, and how this would show mood. This again is also a designer question. Sound designer, lighting designer, costume designer, set designer. These are all design type questions. Okay. 6-mark questions we've talked about before. They're the ones that are usually in a table, 3 boxes either side. So you might get asked to speak about one actor's vocal representation or physicality or characteristics, which are personality traits. We talked about this in class, how Edward is naive, innocent, polite, for example, if it was Edward. So you choose the actor if you get that opportunity to choose it. Sometimes they tell you which one you have to write about. Give 3 vocal representations and justify, and then and so on. So these are little practice questions. This is your kind of practice for the paper. So actually do this a few times. These questions on this PowerPoint, I would scribble some answers to give you an indicator of how long it takes you to answer a question. That's the best thing to do, probably. Right, I'm not going to go through these in any detail because you've got time to do that yourselves, but you need to know all of these stages, and this PowerPoint specifically comes from OCR. So these are the ones that you have to know. Amphitheater, it's got the advantages and disadvantages for each one. Thrust stage, that's the one with the 3 sides that goes like that. So it's quite good because it has a back wall. So you can use that, but you can also get involved with the audience. We've tried it in class and we talked about it in class. Proscenium Arch, this is a very posh theatre, but we talked about how this is the most suitable style for Blood Brothers. In the round, again, we've worked with and discussed. Traverse is the one that has, well, you can see it here. It's like a corridor and it has the audience either side. So we said it's good for things like Railway Children and Murder on the Orient Express. Quite difficult for Brothers, I would think. Promenade Theatre is, we worked with this one a little bit when we did the hospital scene. I think it was Natasha's group that used it, if I remember right. It was about 8 million years ago. But it's when the audience follow the actors around the space and the action takes place in different areas. And then non-conventional theatre, and that's that. So you might get an advantages, disadvantages stage question. In the final, you might not because it's come up 2 years in a row. But I'm sure you'll get some kind of staging question because it is such an important part of any theatre. And that is a director question. So you can see very clearly here which aspect the questions are coming from. So have a little play with that. Think about good and bad stages for Blood Brothers. For each of these, maybe put some pros and cons down. Specifically for Blood Brothers, give specific examples from the text. Don't just talk about the stage. I skipped ahead there. We talked about this as being a really, really nice, yummy question to get. Props for character and what they reveal about them. And that's a 6 marker. So what they reveal about them being the second half of the question. And again, you might get costumes for characters and what this reveals about them. So it's a designer question, of course. This is, you're should begin to see a pattern now. And I would try those out for these 5 characters. Give each of them a prop, give each of them a costume, and then justify why and what this says about the character and why you've designed it that way. Moving to the 8-mark type questions. These are now total game changers, really difficult questions. So we've got a question here about improvisation techniques, which is all those things we do when we prepare for a role in our character workshops, like hot seating, experimenting with space for XMX levels, experimenting with voice, accent, physicality, so gestures, posture, movement, body language. Off-text improvisation we did on the mock devising. That's another good way another good improvisation technique. Improvising script in your own words and all that, walking around the space, writing monologues. It's an acting question. So what things could you do as an actor to create impact in the performance? That's the question that I'm asking. So what things could you do to almost prepare yourself emotionally to create impact in the argument scene with Mickey? So you could talk about your own work here, or you could talk about things that would be beneficial to understand how Mickey feels in the scene when Eddie comes back from university and is all happy and jolly, and they've really grown apart because of circumstance. I mean, people have said some crazy things in exams in the past about role preparation that they've done or could do to help understand those kind of emotions. Research is another thing, but it's about techniques that you could do to help you with it, that you could do in rehearsal to help you with the actual performance. Right, 2 questions to go. Think about the question on the concept performa that you've just answered, and thanks for those, by the way. They are all in. The question about demands for the actor. This is a bit like that, but for the designer. So what would be the challenges for a set designer, costume designer, a lighting designer in communicating meaning? So you've got to first decide what that meaning is, and then you've got to think about what the challenges would be. So for example, how could you show the economic recession if you were a costume designer? How could you show the social divide as a set designer? How can you create mood, build tension as a lighting designer? So think about those. These are much harder questions now, obviously. And then finally, how would you direct the actors to show context? So this is where, if you don't know social, historical, cultural context, it's come up every year so far. I'd be surprised if it didn't come up in some way. Last year it was quite difficult because it was about the acting. So in terms of, in a summary, in a nutshell, there's much more about this in the Blood Brothers Bible. Historical is about youth culture and how that changed, and teenagers being given a name of their own and a group. Recession and unemployment, class divide, depression and crime. Social context is about education, housing, and the new towns. And cultural context is about pop culture, film and TV. You've got the Marilyn Monroe references. These overlap, of course, because education, for example, is part of the cultural and social historical as well. So they do overlap to an extent, but if you want to be really clear in your own head about which category they fall into, you can look at that. But there is an overlap. I went through this in another tutorial, but basically this is what you must know. Read the questions carefully and figure out what it's asking. From which perspective? Actor, director, designer. Circle the keywords in the question. There is enough time to do so because there are so many missed opportunities to justify, to say the why, to explain why you've chosen to do things a certain way. State the moment if it asks for a moment. Write about your own practical work. If it's applicable, you can get full marks without doing so. Remember that you can answer in bullet points to save time. Consider whether it's worth trying to answer the paper backwards on this occasion to see how you cope with that. Manage your time. Remember that you won't have this part of the exam now. That will come much, much later. You will only have the Blood Brothers bit, so it'll be a 55-minute practice paper. Try to make it legible. It's so helpful for the examiners, and answer all the questions.